Yeah.
Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025, and it's 2:00 in the afternoon, and we are joined by our colleagues in the Senate Appropriations Committee. Welcome. We're glad to have you here. There's a seat right here for you. And we also have with us the legislative economist, Tom Cavett, who has been presenting in various places for the last couple of days and will continue this week, the twice yearly consensus revenue forecast. So he presented to the emergency board this morning, and we're very glad to welcome you here. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody.
Oh, do we want to, should we introduce ourselves? Thank you. Andy, there's a seat for you right here. You can get around that way, but we will try. So we'll just go around the room, House and Senate, and you can meet everybody.
Welcome. I'm Dave Iacoboni from Morrisville.
Yep.
Lamoille, Washington District.
Right. A bunch we know. Right.
Welcome, John Krasinski. I live in Burke.
Mike Nigro, represent Bennington and Powell. Tom Stevens from Waterbury, representing the Washington Chittenden District.
Hey, Rich.
Hi, Brennan, Grand Isle County.
Hi, Tom. Jim Harrison, down in Chittenden and a few other communities.
Robin Shy from Middlebury.
Jim Perchick of Washington District. I live in Marshfield.
Bob Norris, Franklin County, and the town of Elberg in Grandin.
Mm-hmm.
Ann Watts, Washington District. I live in Barry.
Wayne Rush, Highgate, Franklin, Berkshire, and Richford.
Hey, Tom. Good to have another Southerner down here,
There we go.
along with Tom from Putney.
Yeah.
Said Wyndham 4, Putney,
Yeah.
Dummerston, the other side of the mountain.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lynn Dickinson. I represent St. Albans Town.
Mm-hmm.
Phil Baruch, Chittenden Central District.
And on the screen, we have Tiff. You want to?
Tiff Bloomley from Burlington.
So the state is pretty well covered, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. And did people have a chance to watch the e-board? I know I was just in Ways and Means and everybody had watched it. And yes, I'm seeing a lot of not great because these I think are best served doing Q&A and not just repeating the same old stuff. And unlike some e-board meetings, this one was a lot more fulsome with the conversation and discussion. Sometimes it kind of zips through and let's just vote this up or down. And there was a lot of conversation about the main points. So I think, a lot of that was covered. And what I'd like to do is just throw it open to questions that you all might have.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I might, I wasn't able to view the e-board, so
Okay.
if you could give us top line or.
Yeah, sure. The first page of this is always kind of, if somebody doesn't have time to read anything else and you just read that, you'll kind of get the picture. The statutory requirement for the revenue forecast is a 2-year thing, and that's why the first chart is just 2 years. And we kept getting requests from the treasurer and from the legislature during session. Bills would come up where they needed a longer term forecast and we do them, but it's not that hard when we're doing the 2-year to take it out 5 years because all the data we're using run out 20, 30, 40 years, just, pro forma. But so we started doing 5-year projections and adding that. It's why the tables for 5 years are at the very end, and they're separate from ones that are 2-year, because what gets voted on is just the statutory numbers. And so anyway, the first page talks about the immediate, stuff, but basically the economy is doing a little bit better than we expected in July. It's really, firing on all cylinders. It doesn't really get a whole lot better than from an aggregate economic perspective than where it's at now. I mean, the incoming Commerce Department secretary has this 3-3-3 thing. And, one of them is 3% real GDP growth. And that is a tall, tall order. It's not going to be easy to do, particularly if labor markets are weaker, but that's sort of a separate topic. We are running in the fourth quarter at a rate above 3, looks like, I mean, the tracking data that we have, and that would put the year very close to 3, a little bit under, which is just remarkable. And at the same time, I mean, there's a lot of labor growth with that. Jobs have gone, we've added jobs for 48 straight months, consecutive months. And job market is still pretty tight. Unemployment rate's 4.1%. Inflation has ticked down to 2.4% on a PCE basis, which is what the Fed uses to track inflation. And that's allowed them to cut interest rates 3 times in September, 100 basis points. And that's a kind of loosening that'll just provide even more support to continued economic growth. Productivity is especially strong. It's just been remarkable, the productivity gains. And that's a win-win all the way around, because you can have corporate profitability going up and wages going up at the same time, and, you know, output being stellar. So good aggregate numbers. I mean, that said, there's a bunch of charts in here and commentary on the flack that economists have taken for saying, oh, the economy is so great, and everybody thinks it stinks if you ask them, you know, I mean, or lots of people think it stinks. Because there are always winners and losers around issues, around what's happening in the economy, and it depends on your perspective and vantage point. We'll talk about some of those in here, but overall it's doing well. And the things that drive revenues, that's what we're looking at mostly. When I say something's positive, it means it's going to result in higher tax revenues. And, you know, that's kind of economic activity that's positive and good. So that's looking great. And as a result, revenues are a little bit stronger than expected through the first half of the year. And again, I can get in if people are interested. There's a lot of detail we can get into, but just the overview. So that's resulted in a slight upgrade across the board. On page 14, there's a table that's sort of is the bottom line for the recommended, we're now approved revenue estimates, the E-board approved. And you can see it's, you know, it's not gigantic, but 1.8% across all 3 funds upgrade relative to July forecast. So this is not the new forecast number. This is a comparison between January and July forecast, but it's $60 million more across all 3 funds, 47 million, 1.4%, 1% in 2027, 0.5%, and basically flat minus 0.1%. 29, but it's across the board is more money than we had thought, but not by some gigantic amount. So this isn't an earth-shaking forecast, but it's a little to the good. So that's kind of broad-based.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then from there was good Q&A at the E-board, so I think we covered a lot of issues, but I know there are others probably people have an interest in. So I think.
Rep. Harrison?
I'm curious as to what the drivers are causing the ed fund to decrease.
Yeah.
I mean, is that sales tax revenue, or is it somehow to do with the grand list?
I think it's mostly, so the grand list, property tax stuff is not in this education fund forecast. That's an event that we do a whole bunch of forecasting in October and all, but these are the pieces of things that used to be in the general transportation fund that got moved to the education fund in whole or part. So meals and rooms is just a part of meals and rooms. And, you know, so those are the things that with this update we're forecasting. I think it's mostly the new taxes that are in sales and use. So that was a cloud tax, which is new. And this is not unusual with new taxes. There are estimates made, but then when the rubber hits the road, sometimes it takes a long time for people to understand them, for compliance to be 100%. Or it may be that the whole universe of tax liabilities is lower or higher than we thought before it was implemented. Some are easy, where you have a tax base, you kind of know what it is, there's a rate that you're charged, you raise the rate a little bit, and you know how it's collected and there's pretty good compliance with that. You adjust the rate and it's kind of automatic. If you just raise the sales tax, that would be the kind of number you get. Get a little bit of elasticity diminishment to that, but you'd have most of that revenue would come through. When you tax an area that hasn't been taxed before, you have to communicate with all the potential payers, some of whom you know from paying other taxes, and others of whom may only pay that tax. And so that can maybe take a while for that to sift through all the programs that accountants use and all the other things that would give rise to knowledge that the tax even exists. So that's a pretty big potential tax. So there was a lot of revenue that was associated with that. And that's simply, from what we know now, that's yielding less than we would have thought. And so we're phasing it in a little bit more gradual way. It's still getting, ultimately by the end of the forecast horizon, pretty much the same amount, but it's initially looks like it's probably low. Same with the meals and rooms short-term rental surcharge. That looks to be a little bit less, yielding a little bit less than we thought it would. So that knocks off a little bit as well. With that one, short-term rentals in general haven't performed quite as well as they did initially. It was sort of really hot and on a steep path up. It really flattened off pretty quickly. So one wonders where the saturation point is for that market, because there are a lot of people that just buy houses and then assume as an investment that they can cover carrying costs and taxes with income from Airbnb type short-term rentals. And, there's been a lot of success with it. We hear about it. It's a market with very low barrier to entry, and anybody who can borrow money or has some can do it. It certainly can drive up prices of houses, but at some point that will become saturated, and then people that can't cover those costs will be in a position of, needing to sell and selling quickly, and might actually cut price to sell. And then you'd see a price correction in housing, which it has plenty of room for, just like the stock market. You look at where stocks are now, and I know it's not historically wise to bet against the US stock market, but it's at such elevated levels, and you just ask yourself, well, how much more growth is there on top of this if I'm putting money in now? Goldman Sachs has argued that they expect like about a 3% return per year over the next decade. That's a radical departure from what we've experienced. There's a chart, the stock market chart's on page 11. And, it's just like a straight line up, and 26.7%, 26.7% gain in 2024. And, so that's, it's up there. But housing prices have also, asset classes across the board have gotten a lot of appreciation. And there's always downside vulnerability when things like that happen, particularly with housing. When you realize at some point it has to match with people's income, because that's what houses are used for. And it's so far out of whack with that at some point, the market's just really thin though, because people are locked into the financing and the mortgages that they have, and they're reluctant to sell because they're not going to get another mortgage like that on whatever house they buy to replace it. So that's all happening. The point about perspective though, too, because the stock market kind of leads to that. On the page right before that, when we say the stock market's up, that's good, right? The economy is doing well, the stock market's up. But there's a table on the preceding, there's page 10, and it shows like if you're in the bottom 50% of the population, by wealth percentile. So if you measure wealth, the Federal Reserve Board has excellent data on net worth by various percentiles. The bottom 50% owns exactly 1% of all equities and corporate equities and mutual funds. So that's, for that group, they'd be like, oh, the stock market's great. It doesn't do anything for them. It's like meaningless information. So your perspective and where you sit has a lot to do with how you think about whether the economy is good or bad or whatever. And then there was a chart that I had in the last forecast in July that was showing the University of Michigan consumer sentiment indices. And they asked people what they think of the economy. And they separated that by party affiliation. And it's dramatic. So, when there's an administration that's of one party, everybody affiliated with the other party thinks the economy's bad. And everybody, the other, party, but it is more extreme. So we looked back at some of the Reagan era data on the same thing. You still get a split, but it's not as extreme as it is now, particularly for the Republican segment of that. So they're both more positive when their candidate is running things, their president is running things, and more negative when they're not. But both parties move that way, but it's significantly more extreme now. And some of that's just the information bubbles that people live in. So it doesn't matter how good things might be for you objectively or based on data that I'm looking at. If you don't think it's good, or people are telling you it's not good, or there's some facet of it you can look at that's not good, that'll color people's
We
perception.
have a question from Rep. Moriki.
Thank you. Looking at a piece of your early report about the childcare payment.
Mhm.
And what I'm reading here, I'm just looking to get a reflection from you. It says actual collections to date have been much lower than expected, but there's insufficient information at this time upon which to base modifications.
What page is that? Can you see that? Oh, maybe 16?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
How I take that is this money's still coming in. We don't know. Don't start playing with it now.
So it's a payroll tax.
Yeah.
So it should come into personal income withholding tax category of revenue that's on the Schedule 2. And so we assumed, based on all the research tax and everybody else did prior to this, that, it should be this amount. It should be this amount paid based on all the people that are paying personal income withholding and, guesses about the fairly small number of exemptions and things that would be holdouts from that, and came up with a number because they weren't going to start taking it out right away, but ultimately that was going to end up not being part of the general fund. So we got a, clean first month number. Here's general fund personal income withholding. But when we're counting that, we, by formula, deducted a part of it and put it down on this line that said, theoretical childcare tax, because we didn't want people to be counting money that, then would disappear. But it should have, so the first quarterly payment is, so it's for the first quarter, was due at the end of October. And so payments were sort of dribbling in, and you got a bigger hit, and they dribble in afterwards too. You add all those up through the first half of the year, and it's $18 million. And in the first quarter, presumably all of those had to do with the first quarter, although we don't really know. It should have been 23 million by our calculation, which should have been $5 million more. So either there's a compliance issue that's going on, or people don't know about it, or the assumptions about who owes it are wrong. But it probably has to do with compliance and just catching up with things. That's why we think at the end of the calendar year, which is also a fiscal year for a lot of companies, that when the professional accountants and tax lawyers and all the rest get involved in looking at the numbers and the balance sheets and everything, they'll recognize there's a liability that maybe wasn't paid. There'll be a true up. But so that could happen over quite a long period of time. Then there are these self-employed people that probably will pay this in April, but some will pay earlier. And so we're not going to know if there is a big lump payment. So January is the next quarter, that which quarter they're paying for or what, it's going to be messy. So that's why we're carrying the same line. And if at the end of the year, there's some shortage relative to it, it'll be a political decision about how to use what will show up as a general fund surplus. It wasn't expected, sort of because we've been deducting this from what we're saying, here's available general fund, don't count all personal income withholding. So,
Craig Bolio, the tax commissioner, was in here yesterday, I think.
Okay, good.
And we asked him for the payroll information up to date, and it's 22.75 million right now.
Good, so that's into
So
January.
it's already, and that's the first quarter plus those who filed early. The filing date for December is Monday, the 27th.
Right.
So we don't actually have all of that.
Right.
So that was a good thing. And if people are listening, we made this an entitlement, and people who are entitled to get childcare vouchers and support are going to get it regardless of what happens with this. That's our job to figure that out.
Yeah, well, and what I'm saying is that the money's there because personal income withholding is tracking at or above expectations.
Right.
And that's what it's derived from and should be linked to. And so either there's going to be extra personal income withholding or the childcare thing will match perfectly and then it'll be even. I doubt it's going to match perfectly as well. And I think they're going to be lags. I'm glad that you had Craig in because that's straight from the horse's mouth. And of course, January should be a big month because by the end of the month, but I'm sure it's going to spill into February and March. And anyway, we do the best we can with this and try to be conservative so you don't get out of your skis and need to all of a sudden have a big fiscal problem. But it may involve political decisions about what to do with funds that.
And we also put $8 million of general fund into the special fund last year.
Yeah.
So we have cushions, and it's not technically a reserve that hasn't been established yet.
Right.
Likely to be, but it hasn't yet.
Right. If you lost 5 million a quarter, you'd wipe out a lot of that very fast. So that's why we're hoping the first quarter is not representative. But with new taxes, it's not unusual for, I mean, there are some that are cleaner than others, but this one is tricky. So anyway, it's a big line item, so it's worth knowing about, even though it's below the.
Right. Rep. Kaczynski, question.
So just, I think, just as a follow-up to the question that was asked, do you think, how much beyond like 12 months plus you think it'll be, as the collection flow gets better, you think it'll be pretty much where you are looking at seeing this come in for us here?
I think you'll get some payments on extension in October. All right. So, this is.
It's new, obviously, here.
Yeah, it's new. So
Playing catch up here a little bit.
it'll probably be sometime in fiscal 26 that we get a cleaner. I don't think by the end of this fiscal year, we'll have it sort of all sorted out and know where all the money is.
I wasn't expecting that. Beyond that point in time.
Yeah, I think
12
then
months plus.
we would get, so we would get a number in November after the October extensions are filed that we could true up to a year, and that's better than a quarter. And then we could look into whether, which assumption wasn't right about what we should have gotten, and then know whether it's maybe compliance or whether there are just a whole lot more exemptions than we would have expected.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Rep. Dickinson.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to ask you about this chart on page 14. Every single line on that shows over a 5-year period a trend of going down. is that because you're being conservative, or is this a demographic issue, or is this a combination, are you anticipating something bad happening, which we've obviously experienced recently? It just, there's no like up and down, there's no up, it's
Okay.
all down.
Yeah, so this isn't the level, like if you look at the tables on the back, starting, the 5-year ones are best because you sort of see the whole kind of up and down, whatever, but
Yeah.
Starting on page 50, those are levels. This is these levels minus the levels in July. So this is the difference, and the difference is narrowing over 5 years. So what we were saying in July about what would happen in fiscal 2029, we're not really thinking there's something radically different about where we'd end up, because a lot of those are sort of demographically grounded, and we're not, saying something's radically different about that. The other thing is that we might have upgraded it flat line across the board. If we just said, economy is stronger and it's likely to stay that way. There are a lot of will be challenges to economic growth with the new administration. So we don't know what's going to actually get passed, and we pretty much have a wait and see approach to that. But the Federal Reserve believes that some of the things that are being talked about could add significantly to inflation, and it's part of why they put their interest rate cuts on hold. They're going to, look at the data and see and all that. It's also why bond markets, push up long-term yields, right away. And there's a lot of movement up, down, sideways, but still, there's concern. Most of the private sector models from big financial institutions and other economic forecasting entities show there to be slightly less growth. It's not like, oh, Trump policies are going to cause a recession. It's more like they could slow growth and raise inflation, slow down the interest rate cuts, possibly even result in an interest rate increase. But, that's just a little bit less growth. So it's not
So you've
quite
taken that
as.
into account.
Yeah, so we're saying, the great news that we have right now is not necessarily replicated, in a additive way across the whole forecast horizon. There are some risks that bring it back down to closer to what we were thinking in July, which wasn't bad. It's just we're not upgrading everything across the board. And, it would just, given the multitude of different policy ideas that have been spoken about, it's really hard to know which ones will be implemented, which ones will survive legal challenges, which ones, and, even something like tariffs where there's a lot of latitude, are they just using it to negotiate and then, back out? Are there going to be carve outs like, part of the reason all these tech company CEOs were at the inauguration in Mar-a-Lago and all the rest is they saw Tim Cook at Apple got these carve outs the last time around with the tariffs in China, so that the phones that he makes over there were exempt. And those sorts of things could change the character of what a tariff is. So until they're implemented, we would be spending inordinate amounts of time guessing, and who knows. So we're just wait and see. When something happens and it's clear, fine, then we'll integrate it with the forecast.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit at the e-board about the tariffs and maybe what happens with Canada and lumber and the cost of construction, for example, and we need housing and what that impacted. We also talked a bit about immigration and what the impacts with not just agricultural workers in Vermont, but also our population and where that comes from. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that for us.
Yeah, so getting to that 3% real GDP growth in large part had to do with increases in the population and labor force. and the availability of jobs. So a whole lot of immigrants came in, but at a time when there were very tight labor markets, so they got put to productive use. And they generated economic output and tax revenue, and there's some sectors that were pretty substantial, where they have real concentrations, and it's different by region of the country. So, but construction workers are, one area. Agricultural workers certainly all over the place, even in Vermont. Healthcare services. If you go to nursing homes and places like that, you will find a really high percentage of people who are from other countries. Some industries are more apt to have differing mixes of legal and illegal. So something like farm labor may have higher illegal components, or construction work or things like that, and others, maybe healthcare would be less so. But again, depends on the part of the country you're in. But without that, you don't get the same output. If you have fewer people, you're going to be very challenged to produce the same amount of economic activity. And big part of the growth in the labor force has been from that. So Vermont has not been heavily or nearly as heavily affected by that as some parts of the country. But it could have been, had we wanted to grow population, probably one of the few avenues where some policy could actually move the needle a little bit. Not that we set immigration policies, but we could have said, all right, we're going to be very welcoming to immigrants, but you need to be careful with that too, because the numbers for a small state could overwhelm it pretty quickly if it was, too much. And you saw that in communities in other parts of the country where, it just, huge numbers. And so then you got all the housing and all the rest. But 1% population growth would be about 6,400 or so people. That sort of number would have been achievable probably. But I don't think so now. And getting it with domestic migration is unlikely. There's just not much you can do to compete. I mean, the reasons people move for jobs is that you have this incredible fluid and mobile labor force, and that's a huge asset in the American economy. But it's not like we can do something that radically changes that. This notion of like paying everybody that comes $5,000 or something like that. Yeah, I'm glad I'm seeing people laughing, because from a demography standpoint, I mean, the first thing you have to understand is that in a normal year, 10,000 people are domestic immigrants to Vermont. In any normal year, 10,000. But about 10,000 people leave the state every year, sometimes a little bit lower or a little bit higher, and that difference is the net change of migration. If you just have a policy that says I'm going to pay everybody $5,000 to coming to the state, well, that's 10,000 times 5,000, that's $50 million. You'd be paying for everybody who would have come anyway. So, and then there was like a study that was done trying to look at whether that was effective or not. So they interviewed people, and you could tell people were trying really hard to be nice about, we took the money and yeah, it was really good. But when they ranked stuff, it was never the top thing. It was always like, I had a job, or, I really like the environment in Vermont or whatever, all the reasons that people come and have come for ages, and hopefully we get more than we lose. But that's really hard to change through public policy. It's just not something we have the resources to do. Same with fertility, and there are charts on that. So it's not like natural population growth is something that is an avenue for some big change in state population.
I was trying to come up with a question from not the other two times that I've talked to you about this before, but in FY 25, you have a 9% decrease in the TIB gasoline, but you don't have a decrease in gasoline. The decreases you're showing in gasoline revenue are different than the TIB. I know the TIB is connected to the price. So are you predicting continuing decreasing gas and diesel prices?
Yeah, pretty weak prices, and there are also complicated triggers that exist within each of these. So there are floors and ceilings and all the rest. And I can't just off the top of my head remember all of the formulas. In the spreadsheets we have, they kick in. But yes, gas prices are projected to be very soft. The United States is already the largest petroleum producer in the world. And one of the other threes is to drill for 3 million more gallons of output. I can't see why anybody in the gas industry would want to do that because it's going to lower price. And they're already, a little bit borderline. So, there's not going to be a great incentive. That will be a very hard three to get to. But there is definitely a push in the fossil fuel area. There'll be a lot of support, and it's going to keep gas prices, fairly low. So we're not getting, much kick for the price only, which is one of the challenges with the T fund is that, when you have, the idea was to have at least a motor fuel assessment tax be price-based and the other one be gallonage based. But when both price goes down and volume used is flat or going down, you're still, a ship without an engine in that case. So gets tough. But that's what's happening with TIP stuff.
Other questions for? Yes. Commissioner Stevens.
Thank you. So what I'm not seeing here, as we're talking about what's a good economy or what a family can afford or what have you, it can speak personally, health insurance, premium, whatever we want to call it, but the tax on healthcare is we're reading 20% increases requested by our health insurance providers. We received a letter from one of our health insurance providers saying that they're losing $100 million a year. We're hearing from hospitals that they're other people saying that hospitals are too expensive or hospitals can't make it. Where does that fit in any of your calculations, or is that kind of in a separate category altogether?
It isn't something we've done a deep dive into. We've looked at healthcare costs in broad ways for other projects and entities, but what it would do in terms of tax revenues would affect disposable income. So people, generally a healthcare expense insurance would be a deductible item, so it would lower your tax liability if you had more. If you're having to pay more of your disposable income for healthcare, then you would have less to spend on everything else, and also your taxable income would be a little bit lower. But we haven't done any quantitative analysis to look at how much more and when that would hit and how many people it would affect and this sort of thing. So that's a good area of inquiry that we should keep in mind.
And just a second question on your 5-year projections. My take on these presentations, and I think you've said it before in the past, is that this is a snapshot of what exists now with the caveat that you've been explaining, which is regardless of a new presidential administration, regardless of the threats that have been made to some economic balances here with tariffs, et cetera, you've always emphasized that it's just a snapshot. And I just want to make that clear to us. So when I see a 5-year outlook, am I to say that's based on everything that you know as of the minute that you printed that? without taking into account the possibilities of what may happen, adding variables, say on a $7,000 tariff on an automobile without, sales and use tax for us. Is that an accurate way of thinking about the 5 year out?
That is, I mean, I heard information today that, so Craig comes in and says, here's what it is so far in January. All right, that's start wheels turning about, okay, what's our second quarter? How does that compare? So all that would start happening. What I will say is, and, looking at, there's some demographic data that's in there, we talk about that. We maintain this database of single age, Vermont population by single age and gender, and use that, to forecast going out. And some things are harder to forecast than others. If you said, what's the stock market going to be in 5 years? You have a pretty wide band. Even if you said, what's the price of oil? You look at the Energy Administration's forecasts of West Texas crude intermediate, and the bands immediately span out to huge ranges of high and low, just because it's a volatile good that's traded and supplies can get cut off and all this kind of thing. But when we look at population forecasts, and, I'll go back to the enrollment forecasts, that we did in the mid 1990s. On page 8, the chart of age 0, which is births in Vermont, going back to 1980. And in about 1996, we did the first enrollment forecast using this database. And you can see that about 6 years prior to 1996, there started to be a pretty steep decline in the number of births. And we looked at that and said, oh, I know how many 4-year-olds there are going to be next year is how many 3-year-olds there are today. For the most part, there's a little bit of migration in and out, but you're going to be pretty close. And there was no way so we had a declining enrollment forecast and nobody believed it. Everybody thought enrollments had never declined. They just keep going up every year, and it would not be prudent to, assume they're going to drop just because some analysis says they're going to drop. But if it's based on data that's really hard, so I'm much more confident about a forecast based on something like demographics, which are much less mutable than something, based on a price or on, another economic variable. So it depends. So the 5-year projections all have some sort of demographic group, but they're piles of assumptions that go into them. And those assumptions are critical, obviously. And you have events like pandemics that show up. I mean, the distortions to the data, that the pandemic, they're just like wild swings up and down and everything else. And we're still living with a lot of the consequences of those. So we look at gasoline gallonage, and we'll talk about this in some of the transportation committee meetings tomorrow. There was a decline in gallons of gas consumed for a while because cars were becoming more efficient. And then electric vehicles were slowly being introduced. But the pandemic hits and nobody's moving. So everybody's stuck. So the gallons consumed goes way down. After the pandemic eases, it goes back up, but it doesn't go up nearly as high as it had been because a lot of people are still working at home part-time, with a hybrid work. They're just simply not driving as much. And that's not something that we would have forecast happening before, 5 years before. So there are things like that come into play. But generally speaking, something demographic is a much harder base to root something on. And there are things we have to do forecasts for that are 25 or 50 years. Capital assets, power plants, things like that. When companies building factories, they don't care about a 2 or 3 year forecast. You dump $1 billion into some plant making gypsum wallboard or something like that. And you have to look at a 25-year, even if it's pro forma, just to say, here's why we're putting $1 billion here, is we really believe something like this is going to happen. Might be a little better or a little worse. We hope it's a lot better, but there are implicit forecasts going on all the time. This just puts a marker out there, says this is reasonable based on a whole set of assumptions. And sometimes it can be useful because you'll see something like declining enrollments for the first time. That should have been a real flare because it gives you time to plan and you could figure out, is there some way we can, manage costs to the served population? But when it happens late and it's after the fact, it's just a lot messier and harder to do. So that's why we tried it in case there's something that is kind of a warning. The cigarette thing with the use of the nicotine pouches, there's a whole thing on it, of course, in the e-board was talked about. But, that's tiny, but still, okay, $6 million, but 5 years out, then, it gives you an order of magnitude of what it could do. It might be worse. It might get ruled like Juul or something to be illegal quickly. But the FDA just on the 16th of this month gave it approval to market it and run with it. So, that's something we should be aware of and we can take action now. Anyway.
So Rep. LaRouche and then Rep. Pearson.
So back on gas prices, obviously if gas prices go down, there's more disposable income, whether it's for a person or for a corporation, whoever is using energy. So I understand it would be extremely complicated to calculate how that moves out forward, because you'd expect to have more revenues, more taxes generated because of that, and maybe not in the same place.
That's it. It's not in the same place.
But someplace else, but
Yeah.
understanding that it's hard to calculate, but looking at historical record in terms of when prices went up and down and how much tax revenue or GDP was generated as it went up and down. Do you have any assessment of, proportionally, is it more or less? Do you do better? Do we do better as a whole when prices go down, or do we do more poorly?
Well, because Vermont doesn't produce the gas, so if Vermont had producers on the one hand that were getting income from it, you'd have some proportionality. We benefit from declining gas prices. We don't make the stuff. So states that, their revenues of producers will be going down and they'll get various offsets, again, through different taxes sometimes. We did a thing quite a ways back where we had $1 for every dollar, for every penny change, was done like that, how it would affect the state. But I haven't revisited that for a long time. Really high gas prices haven't been as much of an issue. I can see if I could dig that up and get a rule of thumb kind of thing. But it's a plus to the state because otherwise it's a drain that just goes out. Now with electric vehicles, if you have solar panels, or to the extent the state's generating electricity in state, then you're producing the fuel also. So your return on that investment would be different and that kind of thing. But that would complicate it a little bit.
Understood. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So as you've said before, Vermont is tied to the national economy in many ways. I'm curious as to what you're seeing in other states, especially in the Northeast. If we're going up 3% in state revenues, are they going up 3%, or are they going up less, or are they going up more? I'm just trying to, if there's any relative measure of the state's economy. A lot of times we look at, well, how are the tax, especially personal income, how would that measure? I'm curious of what you're seeing in that compared to Vermont.
I haven't done a recent comparison. Comparing tax revenues is hard because there are a lot of changes in tax rates and new taxes and discontinued taxes and things like that happen. So it's hard to kind of get a clean read, but other metrics like GDP and personal income and all that are available across all states. So they're things that we can measure, the unemployment rate is, there's a chart on that in here. Vermont usually is either the lowest, either Vermont or New Hampshire. And it's pretty close to 50-50 as to when one or the other is the lowest one. Usually in growth metrics, all of New England is lower than the US. But states with a little more population growth will be showing more other kinds of growth. I could pull some stuff together, but I don't have instant metrics. It's interesting. I'm on a policy advisory board for the Boston Fed and sort of the Vermont voice on it, but they're equivalent people from all the other New England states. And it's always interesting to hear what the issues are and, how they're doing. One state that had been doing pretty poorly for quite a while was Connecticut. Had relatively high unemployment rates, had very little appreciation in home prices. And then after the pandemic, you got a whole lot of people from urban areas that then are working at home. So instead of in New York City, in Connecticut, and all of a sudden, a whole lot of the metrics change for Connecticut, and it's right up there on that unemployment chart. I think I don't know exactly what its ranking is, but it's much improved. It used to be way down at the bottom. Connecticut is now all right, so third after New Hampshire, and in the top 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's a 10th best. It was like way down at the bottom before. So Rhode Island has often been something of a laggard in growth and performance and such, but each state kind of has its own story, and that's complex. But we could run some broad metrics by state, and
I mean, I think the GDP, what do you call it, gross domestic product, would be probably as good a measure as any. I'm just curious as to, obviously, we all want to improve our state's economy.
Yeah.
And are we doing a good job at that?
Yeah.
Or there's something really beyond our control sometimes with the demographics that's holding us back too. So.
Yeah. Well, and again, you could have no change in your population base and still have a good economy if everybody in that population base who wanted a job could get a job, and if the job quality was reasonably good, and if the people were, able to afford the things that they need, housing, healthcare, education, all the things like that. So you wouldn't have to grow to be good, but it's easier when you're growing.
Oh, but if you're stagnant, it does put additional pressures, whether it's education, spending, which ultimately comes out of each of our pockets, or healthcare that was mentioned before. I mean, if we are in fact one of the highest in healthcare costs, and I don't know if we are or not, but that's been sort of reported in some of the information we've been receiving. And if it is, that money that ultimately is either got to come out in taxes that we pay, or it's got to come out of our pocket in terms of premiums or co-pays. And it's got to have an impact on the overall economic ability that we have.
Right. But if you had a static population, you could still have incomes growing because people's incomes could go up each year. And as long as your incomes are going up more than or equal to the expenditure side of it, it is much more of a challenge to manage, especially declining served populations, because you have infrastructure. So take, the issue with schools in Vermont. So you have all these facilities. And if all of a sudden you don't need them, and you don't think you're going to need them for the foreseeable future, and you can't really increase enrollments, easily, that's difficult to go down. Anyway.
We have two more questions, and then I know you have to go to Senate Finance after this, is what I've been told. So
Okay.
Senator Watson and then Rebecca.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. One, the graph on page 34 about the top 0.1%, top point, the next 0.9%, et cetera. I'm just noticing that that is data for the US.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if such a data set exists for Vermont in particular, because I imagine since we're looking at the one in the US, that maybe a data set for Vermont does not exist.
You're right. Regrettably,
Which is okay.
there
I'm just curious.
isn't data. Yeah, there was a stab, Joyce Manchester took a stab at it. And the data are, I mean, you have to make a lot of assumptions. And the problem with that really top, especially the top 1/10 of 1%, but even the top 1%, is that the numbers are really small. There's only 132,000 households in the country that are in the top 1/10 of 1%. And in a little, even if you had a proportional number in Vermont, it would be a handful. And then which handful it is. If it's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and whatever, well, we're in the trillions and, it's a different sort of thing. If it's, there could still be very wealthy people that aren't, so you'd have to have pretty much a universe count. And the Federal Reserve Board does a very good job getting a big enough sample to be able to have credible stats. There's nothing like that at the state level. So it's really hard to do.
That's fair enough. And I guess it comes out of a wondering of, relative to the United States, is Vermont's gap smaller or more exacerbated, or what is, it would just be interesting, but totally understand that maybe that data doesn't exist.
Well, there've been some stabs at it. So we could share some things that people have done in general, inequality in general. And income inequality is a lot easier because we have hard data on that, but wealth is different.
And then the other question that I have is maybe outside the scope of this report particularly, but, thinking about the economy as sort of the flow, I guess I think about it analogously to the flow of water in a ocean. And so this is really looking at, or in a bathtub perhaps, right? That this is looking at the water coming in. And I'm just wondering if there is equivalent kind of report or data about the water going out, if that makes sense. Like how is money leaving the state? Again, that maybe that's hard to collect because we can see the water going in, and maybe it's harder to see the water going out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was an early economic model in England, like way back, before computers, that tried to use plumbing to essentially model flows. And they had honestly, I mean, I should see if I can get more of that because it was intriguing, but not very accurate.
Like pretty cool.
But it was a good stab at it. So when you say things coming into the economy, I'm thinking of things that come into the state as revenue. So those would be flows in, and then the things that go out would be expenditures. So that would be your exit.
Out of state expenditures.
But out of state. Okay, so as a model.
Yes, and it goes to the.
Okay, yeah. So all right, this speaks to broader economic models that we work with and sometimes build look at inputs to produce something and outputs then what it produces. And then a very important issue is where do you get those inputs? And if they come from out of state, that's different than if they come from in-state in terms of the jobs impact. So for example, if we produced oil and refined gasoline and they did that, we'd have a bunch of jobs that are in-state. As gas demand goes up, there'd be more jobs and that we'd benefit from that. But if we just buy the gas and it goes out, then there's no more job creation except for the people that deliver the gas. So the intermediaries and things like that. So yes, they're input output models they're called regional purchase coefficients that look at, how much is contained within the borders of any particular, name it, geography. And that's done at the state level and national levels too. So yeah, there are times that we use those models though to try to look at an economic impact of something that has a lot of cross-border flows. Yeah.
Thank you. Rep Yakaboni?
Do you track the credit scores of Vermonters as a way of trying to determine the financial stability of our population?
I don't, but I'd like to. I know the data exists and I know some people quote it, but I don't know if you have to pay for it, if it's expensive. There's some data sources that are free that are pretty good, but I think it's an Equifax thing that compiles it across things. And Moody's Analytics talks about it. So I think they must have, at least have access to it, but I could look into that. Because that would be useful. Yeah.
And last question from,
Yeah, I think I'm trying to go back to what the senator just asked about the looking at wealth coming in or income coming in and income going out. You know, I don't think she's thinking, in my mind, what I heard was she wants to know, how do we track the people who leave with money and how do we track the people who come in with money? I heard your answer talking more about tracking production from industries and sectors and
Flows.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I don't know if I'm correct, but that's what I thought you were. Yeah.
So the way the models handle, whether somebody's coming in, they'd be using averages across things like this. So you'd say for each person coming in, there would be, you know, certain attributes that would be fine, but it wouldn't be based on actual data of whoever it is that's coming in. We tried during the pandemic to try to get tax profiles of new taxpayers to see how, you know, there was a good population surge right after the pandemic, and we weren't sure if it was temporary or permanent. It looks like it was mostly permanent, but we wanted to know, are those wealthier or, you know, where did they fit on the spectrum? And we could get a little bit of information, but even that was tricky. That was through tax. So that, you know, yeah, I mean, that's a different kind of question because that's not part of the flows. That's more, what are the characteristics of, you know, in migrants and out migrants. So generally speaking, over time, in migrants to Vermont had higher incomes than the people leaving. So, but not by a great deal, because most of the migration takes place with younger people who are more mobile. So that you're not usually getting huge numbers with that. But if there's a specific question around that, we could dig into some of that with tax or somebody else if that was.
Well, there's a myth out there that the well-to-do people are leaving because of, but I also understand that when young people are not making a whole lot of money and they get out of school and they move to go somewhere else, that maybe offsets that.
Yeah, and the other thing with population data, this is something, nobody's asked this question before, but there's a chart on page 48 that shows the share of total state population age 18 to 22. I think very few people guess that Vermont has the highest share in the nation, and consistently does, of people 18 to 22. And the reason is that it's college. Yeah. So college students are, you know, are part of the resident population. It's different than some other versions of population. And we have a lot of colleges relative to the size of the state. So a lot of people come in. That produces in these charts, there's these single age charts, you know, for every year, 1980, here's the 2021 though. And you see there's this big spike here. That's all just people that are in college. So they're going to leave. That's not something that you would use to forecast. In fact, that's something we have to clean out of the data when we do an age forecast. So there is an echo to the baby boom. Baby boom is the oldest cohort, but there's an echo that's a little bit of a lump. And actually, if you look at the 40 to 54 cohort, which the governor cited in his inaugural address, that actually will be increasing between now and 2030 just by virtue of the fact that there's a little bump from the children of the baby boom population. It's not anywhere the size of baby boom population, but there's a little bit of an echo. Anyway, you have to take out the college students because that's a big part of it. Anyway, little wrinkles in the whole thing.
Well, we really appreciate you coming, Tom, and this has got lots of good material for people to read. So we will go up live in just a sec. All of us will be at the meeting up on the floor at 3:45, and our committee will be meeting here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you, Senate Appropriations, for joining us.